Good afternoon all, and now for something completely different. No, only kidding. All right, look, what I'll be doing is giving you a brief snapshot of some big picture issues with regard to the dependence of Asia on Gulf oil and various other resources that have to traverse through the Indian Ocean, and some of the problems that may actually come as a consequence of this very unstable world that we've been hearing about today. Okay, so, good. Okay, first I thought I'd actually start off by giving a few figures just to give you an idea of the sense of the scale of the problem, right? We're dealing with the major Asian economies, for instance, and here I break it down to China, Japan, India, and Korea. Number 2, number 3, number 4th, and number 15th major economy in the world, and of course, the amount of the resource that is required to power these economies along. As you can see, with regard to the natural gas usage, we're talking in the trillions of cubic meters a year. That has to keep on cranking on every year to give us the kind of growth and security that the world needs for the economies to flourish. What I did do, because I didn't know how to use this, so pardon me while I go back, oil consumption. Again, here we have barrels per day. China, over 9 million barrels per day. Down to South Korea, just over 2 million barrels per day. These are not insignificant figures, and sometimes in the course of trying to work out why the connection between, say, the Middle East and Asia is important, we tend to lose sight of the scope. But let's go a little bit further, shall we? Okay. China, foreign dependency on oil, for instance. Here you can see quite clearly that in spite of China's efforts at trying to diversify its oil resource by bringing in Africa, obviously Russia, Sudan, Venezuela, a whole heap of other countries, including Kazakhstan. Most importantly, you'll notice that Saudi Arabia, Iran, Oman, Iraq, Kuwait, UAE will constitute about 2/3 of China's supply for oil. This pattern is replicated when it comes to Japan. Saudi Arabia gives 33% to Japan. Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Iran. Well, India again. And South Korea. So, essentially all of the most significant Asian economies are on average 2/3 dependent on the oil emanating from the Gulf region. Natural gas supplies are obviously a little bit more diversified, but the key to natural gas supplies, of course, is the tiny sheikhdom of Qatar. Qatar is a major supplier. And of course, obviously sitting in and among the Gulf region, it's a very, very disruptive little area. Any disruption to the sea lines of communication between the Gulf and the major Asian economies will have a negative impact on Asian and global growth. That is a fact. Well, so, when we're talking about the stability and the security of the various sea lines of communication, obviously we have to start looking at threats. And I'll start with some of the more obvious threats to the security of the sea lines of communications. First and foremost, a broader Middle East war that may grow out of the current civil war in Syria. Now, even if the West weren't to get themselves directly involved in any such conflagration, we can be almost guaranteed that the idea of this civil war turning into a more broad-based regional war will send oil and gas prices through the roof. Okay? Again, if we further that and go into the idea of a potential Israeli or US strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities, any kind of Iranian retaliation may include the closure or the attempted closure, and I actually stressed the attempted closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm not necessarily convinced that Iran has the military, conventional military or unconventional military capability to actually shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That place has got so much US technology overseeing and surveilling that area that I'd find it very hard to believe that Iran could pull off a Pearl Harbor-style surprise attack and just grab something in that area. We have to understand that the United States has at its disposal a constellation of satellites that have that place totally covered. But Iran can try. And if Iran tries to make a move into the Strait of Hormuz to try to disrupt the supply of oil, again, that is going to have a catastrophic effect on the economy of the world, not just Asia, but everywhere. And again, some of the potential retaliation scenarios that we could have a look at is perhaps the Iranian Revolutionary Guard having raids against pipeline networks, oil and gas terminuses, onshore and offshore rigs and platforms. Iran has got a ballistic missile capability, but those ballistic missiles, if you don't believe in all the hype that does come out of some of the more interesting war-y journals, some of the ballistic missiles are actually not as accurate as first thought. So the ballistic missiles probably, if they were ever used, would be used as terror weapons. Okay, you fire one or two of them across a city, and that will send a city like Dubai or Manama into an absolute panic. Okay. Then, of course, we've got the whole issue of terrorist cells that could destabilize Gulf Arab monarchies, launch random attacks against population centers, or conduct assassination campaigns against government figures. I mean, that, again, is a terror kind of response, and it would be a reasonably common sense strategy for a country like Iran to actually go ahead and do, because quite frankly, I can't see how they would be able to go head-to-head with the US military. Even though we have been told today that the US is in decline, and obviously it is, and the ability for the Americans to actually keep its military growth at current levels will diminish in the not too distant future, the fact remains that US technology levels are really quite amazing, and they will be able to do something to shut some of those threats down. More threats. The possibility of naval clashes between India and Pakistan, either as part of these two states' ongoing and sometimes violent confrontation, or as part of a new general war between them. One of the things that we tend to not sort of give too much credence to when we look at the whole involvement of India within that sort of greater Asian context is, well, what happens to Pakistan? I mean, again, it's one of those 64,000-pound elephants sitting in the room. No one wants to talk about it because, it's a very difficult sort of situation. With regard to Pakistan, it's essentially a failed state, or maybe not a failed state, that's being too cruel. It's a failing state, but it's nuclear armed. Its military, or components of its military, are actually quite good. And also, it's been penetrated by some jihadist sentiment as well. And now, because of the really bad relations that Islamabad has with Washington, the idea that Islamabad would roll out the red carpet for, a little bit of Chinese assistance to give it to the Americans over a particular issue seems to be something that may actually happen at some point. The world is changing, and as this morning demonstrated, that is going to be accelerating over the next few months, and if not the next 2 years. We're going to see a very different planet. So in that case, the idea of the Pakistanis acting perhaps as a tool for Chinese strategic advantage. If the rest of the world wants to hem China in, what's China going to do? It's not going to sit there. It will try to find a way in which it could break out. And so far we know that China does supply Pakistan with a lot of its conventional military weapons. So it's perhaps a marriage made in heaven? I don't know, but it's certainly a mutual convenience. Of course, another one of the threats that need to be looked at is the possibility of US interdiction of Chinese vessels carrying oil and gas to China during a period of tension or war between the US and China. Now, hopefully that will always be an unlikely scenario, but we can't dismiss it. If we're looking at potential threats to the sea lines of communication between the Gulf and to the Far East, we must take this into consideration. And it was interesting in conversation earlier, I was wondering about how a Romney presidency would try to confront China, or whether or not what we're seeing at the moment, because it's part of a presidential campaign, is just talk. Because the idea of the US fully confronting China is a horror show. Well, one other thing that we haven't discussed here is the fact that there are overlapping financial interests. The West has a lot to lose because they've invested in the whole Chinese miracle. Japan has invested in the whole Chinese miracle. The idea of this leading into a major conflagration would be not in anyone's interest, but obviously in terms of looking at what the potential threats are out there, one has to take this into consideration. And of course, the most obvious third primary threat, piracy. An increase in the tempo of pirate attacks on oil and gas tankers traversing the Red Sea, the Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the East African littoral, and the archipelagic Southeast Asian waters. Such attacks can expect to push up the insurance premiums of shipping companies, and those costs invariably get passed on to the consumer. So if we add that to what was discussed earlier in terms of having just this incredibly tense situation, then obviously this is not something that's going to help oil prices stabilize in the near term, because the cost of actually transporting the oil to and fro, if it keeps on going up because insurance premiums keep getting bumped up, that's going to have an effect on us as well. Pirate attacks obviously lead to calls for private security companies to defend shipping and or for an open-ended deployment of naval warships to act as deterrents to piracy. We've actually seen this. We've had NATO warships, we've had Chinese warships, we've had a whole heap of warships sort of patrolling up and down the East African littoral trying to sort of clamp down on piracy. Have they been successful? I'd argue from a technological standpoint they've done pretty good in terms of tracking the patterns with regard to piracy without necessarily stamping it out, because the incentives for the people who indulge in piracy aren't there to stamp it out. You have to look at the poverty in East Africa, in the coastal areas. That's a key driver. When fishermen have their resources stripped by European, Asian, industrialized fishing coming into their waters, these people who are subsistence fisher people, they need to take the fish to feed their families and also take it to market and make money. If they can't do that, of course they're going to be looking for an alternative. Piracy, unfortunately, is an alternative. This just gives you some illustration of the scope of piracy attacks from 2008 to 2011. And as you can see, in 2008, the blue dots, you'll see it's very close to the sort of Somali area up here. The further you go out into time, the further and the more prolific the attacks. And of course, in 2011, you can see that some of the attacks have actually taken place about 1,000 kilometers off the East African coast. So they're becoming more brave, more organized. And one of the things about piracy that we have to also bear in mind is where are they getting their information to make the major attacks? You know, when they take over a bulk freighter or something like that, you know, when you're talking about a subsistence fisherman, and they know how to actually attack a massive boat and take it in, they must get their information from somewhere. So perhaps, just perhaps, and I am putting this out there, there is a sort of white-collar racket somewhere, I can't say where, but somewhere, feeding them the information necessary to allow them to have that kind of capability. Right? This gives you just an idea of the scope of pirate attacks from this part all over here. And of course, if we talk about Southeast Asia has had a number of different anti-piracy norms, conditions, laws, and everything else trying to be put into place, but it's the implementation of these things that seem to be missing. So again, one has to question, the nation states in Southeast Asia, are they truly, truly intent on clamping down on piracy? I don't know. But that's a lot of pirate attacks.
What time period is that?
Say again?
What time period is this?
Time period? This is just a grab of from say about 2008 to maybe 2011. 2011 has been pretty much the last lot that I managed to get through. Yeah.
It should be appreciated too that attacks in Southeast Asia are extraordinarily minor, anything, not big ships at all.
That is true, but piracy tends to get looked at as a larger concern. Yeah. Well, we can talk about that later. Okay. So, what does this mean? Okay. The sea lines of communication are not as secure as they should be to guarantee supply of oil and gas from the Gulf to the major Asian economies. This kind of plays to long-held fears that in major Asian economies are being dependent on Western naval and military help to keep these hydraulic societies functioning at current levels. The alternative, of course, is to seek energy independence by exploiting potential oil and gas fields closer to home. For China, this means projecting its naval power into the South China Sea at the expense of the less powerful Southeast Asian states. For Japan, it means maintaining its rage against China over the disputed claim to the Senkaku Islands. For India, it means building up an independent naval presence to dominate the subcontinental peripheral. And for South Korea, it means trying to keep its diplomacy nimble enough to navigate between the wants and needs of China and Japan while keeping the US actively involved. There are some historical issues that also need to be looked at, I think, because, again, when we're talking about the sort of threats to the maritime threats to the sea lines of communication, we tend to look at things from a very single-minded focus. How many ships are you building, right? We talk about China building an aircraft carrier, for instance, and we think, well, obviously, if they're building one aircraft carrier for training purposes, they're obviously going to be building a whole heap more. And the more aircraft carriers they build, the mightier the Chinese Navy. But it's not just about building ships. Naval might is also about organizational culture. And if you look at the last time China was a great maritime power, I think it was about 1403 to 33 under Admiral Zheng He, if memory serves me correctly. That was a long time between drinks. It's only now that China is starting to develop a major blue water capability. And there have been questions to suggest that the way that the Chinese Navy is actually building itself up, it looks very fierce, but the logistic train necessary to project power further afield still it hasn't been put into place. So how much of what we know about Chinese military increases are exaggerated fears, and how much is based in reality? Okay? When we look at the historical issues, I mean, China has, for most of its history, been a land power. And as a land power, its greatest threat came from the northwest. It was Mongol horsemen that actually shook China. And again, because of that very fact, and because Zheng He's fleet was demolished afterwards, the loss of ability to sort of see the ocean as a natural area for it to defend has been a long time coming. It's here, obviously, but it may take quite some time for the Chinese to actually get to a point where they can go head-to-head with another navy at a similar level. Japan, of course, is mindful of the problems it faced during the 1930s over its pre-war oil embargo that was placed upon it. The oil shocks of the 1970s reconfirmed Japanese fears over its lack of energy self-sufficiency. Hemmed in by Article 9 of the post-war constitution, successive Japanese governments during the 1990s have weakened these provisions, allowing the Japanese self-defense forces to deploy away from the Japanese home islands under certain conditions. Japan is, however, unable to independently use its military instrument for offensive action. So, let's have a look at some more. India, again, like with China, India was a land power. India had enough navigable rivers for most of its history to allow penetration within the Indian subcontinent. It had a thriving coastal trade, but it didn't have a major navy. It didn't go through a sort of naval spurt like the Chinese did in the 1400s. So it built itself a huge naval infrastructure during the 20th century, but yet that naval infrastructure was pretty much directed toward the threat emanating from Pakistan. Today, arguably, its non-aligned status has actually held it back from actually turning it into the kind of power projection force that most people think the Indian Navy actually is. And this is a problem because, of course, the Indian Navy at the moment really does lack the ability to control the approaches to the Arabian Sea to this day. And of course, South Korea, it's a small country. It's a dynamic economy. It's a highly technological economy, but still, its military abilities are very much limited by its size. And also, it's sitting between China and Japan. Both countries have relatively large fleets in terms of numbers. So, okay, conclusion, there is no smooth sailing in terms of energy security for the major Asian economies. Neither China, Japan, India, South Korea individually or collectively have the required naval might to supplant the US as a guarantor to the security of the Indian Ocean sea lines of communication. The Gulf region will, for the foreseeable future, act as a locus of potential internal political instability and interstate conflict. Just finally, some future drivers. The major Asian economies will seek to exploit oil and gas resources closer to home to their own state boundaries, especially in contested areas. This will inevitably see a clash against the interests of smaller neighbours who also seek to exploit these same or adjacent resources. As these clashes intensify, the smaller players might well be displaced from these areas over time unless they bandwagon with the US, or perhaps even bandwagon among themselves. As a continued injection of US power in highly contested offshore energy resource areas in maritime Asia may draw the US into regional confrontations and possible conflicts over time. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention.